see anything?" Those were the words that Jesus spoke to the blind man he was healing in Mark 8. A man waking up to the world of wonder around him. A man who Jesus brought out of a lifetime of darkness into the light. Do you see anything? Our eyes are the most incredible organs. Even with my limited medical understanding, I can just marvel at the way that they take in images and process them and transmit those to our brains. And I also find it mind-boggling that we each view the same things in very different ways. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was a big story that hit the headlines about a particular dress. It was a really simple photograph of a woman's dress that some people saw as black and blue and other people saw as white and gold. It was bizarre and fascinating and a stark example of how we can see the same thing in very different ways. Just before Jesus heals the blind man in Mark 8, he challenges the people around him and says to them that they have eyes that don't see and ears that don't hear. Jesus came to bring us more than just physical sight, but he came to spiritually open our eyes to his presence, to his plan, to his kingdom coming in our lives. I believe that moments in history, like the one that we're living in now, are opportunities for us to allow Jesus to open our eyes and see things differently. A couple of weeks ago, I bought myself a pair of these. The increased screen time that's come with lockdown had really taken its toll on my eyes, but having these new glasses really made me challenged and think about how am I seeing the world in a different way at the moment. A number of friends have said to me that they're taking this lockdown as a real opportunity to reassess what's around them, to reassess their priorities, to allow God to speak to them and really consider what they should take forward from this time and what's maybe better left behind. And I don't think there's just a few of us who are experiencing that awakening to seeing life differently. As a whole society, the COVID-19 crisis has made us take our usual lenses off and see the world in a different way. One thing in particular that I think is challenged in us has been our way that we see connecting with one another. Before the outbreak, we were living in a world that was declining into less and less connection with one another. Over the past 50 years, in the West, we've steadily shifted towards a society of much smaller households, very rarely living in extended family, with many people living alone. We've also seen a massive increase in loneliness and mental health decline, in suicide rates rising. And despite the internet's amazing ability to allow us to connect in more ways, we just seemed so busy, so driven by our success, what's on TV, maybe caring more about the number of likes we got on our social media accounts rather than our reality of needing real relational connection with each other. It's taken a crisis to wake us up to our declining connectivity. It's been the removal of our interactions that's exposed our longing for a relationship. As Christians, we should be experts at relationships because relationship is what following Jesus is all about. In John 1, we read that we're made to be the family of God, that following him gives us the right to become children of God. Surely this should mean that our identity as the family of God is a priority for us. However, the bishop and theologian Tom Wright says this: "Many people today find it difficult to grasp this sense of corporate Christian identity. We have been so soaked in the individualism of modern Western culture that we feel threatened by the idea that our primary identity being that of the family we belong to. The church is not simply a collection of isolated individuals, all following their own path of spiritual growth without much reference to one another. We need to learn again the lesson, to take St. Paul's image of the body of Christ, that a hand is no less a hand for being part of a larger whole, an entire body. Cutting them off to make sure they were truly free, truly themselves, would be truly disastrous." Isn't that image just incredible, that we are parts of a body making a whole together, and that only in our wholeness can Jesus be fully present and represented to the world? But I think there's a challenge to us there too. Have we allowed our cultural filter of individualism to determine our ability to be the family of God? When we look through the Bible, we see God's heart to build a family that belongs together and with Him. We're made for a relationship. We see that in God's creation, in His promise to Abraham, in His orchestration of freedom to the Israelites and their new life in the Promised Land. We see it in His desire to reconcile us to Him through the cross and resurrection, a place in union with the Father, Son and Spirit, the family of God together. So what exactly does this family look like in practice? Well, we get a particular look at that in the practicalities and description of the early church in Acts 2. From verse 42 it says, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favour of all the people. And the Lord added to their number those who were being saved." There's some incredible and challenging things for us to read in that passage. They were learning, growing in the apostles' teaching and living it out, sharing with new believers who were continually joining them. They were being devoted, not just to learning, but devoted to one another. They devoted themselves to fellowship. The word fellowship is what we would now call community. And when we're devoted to someone or something, we're committed to them. We're diligent with our pursuit of them. We want to love them wholly. We want to see that project succeed. We give time to them. We adapt our lives around them. The believers had everything in common. They shared their possessions and met one another's needs, and they continued to meet together every day. They ate together, shared communion together, they worshipped together. What a challenge to us. Whenever I read that passage, I have a sense of longing for more of who I believe God has made us to be. So how do we step out and grow in this during a time where we might feel incredibly separated from one another? Well, I think there are some key principles that we can apply even to our current situation, even if it means being a little bit experimental at this time. So firstly, I think there's a challenge for us to connect. If the early church met in extended families on a daily basis, then we've got some way to go to have that level of interaction with one another as a church. It might be that you're looking to ride out the storm of COVID-19 with a good number of box sets, learning to crochet and occasionally Zooming some friends and family. Those are all really good things, but I'd argue that that's not quite the fullness of family life that God invites us into. In my role here in Derby, overseeing Reach communities, I've just been massively encouraged to hear over the last few weeks about how our communities have been expressing that kind of devotion to one another that we read about in Acts 2. Communities shopping for one another when they have members who are isolated, taking time to be available to one another, to check on how each other are doing. Our communities have been worshipping together, even if that has to look slightly different online in this time. They've been sharing activities like cooking and eating together. They've been praying and sharing communion, having fun with things like quiz nights, connecting on coffee breaks. There's a whole host of ways that we can be connected and endeavour to share normal life with one another at the moment. Secondly, I think there's something in this passage about the openness that we see in the family of God, a willingness to allow one another access to our lives. That's more than just giving people our Sunday best. The church in Acts must have seen the warts and all of one another, their lives enmeshed as a family, involved not just for a couple of hours a week where they can put their face on, but in and out of each other's daily business, observing each other's needs, seeing their character flaws, the brokenness that each of us had, and seeing the demonstration and the fruit of the Holy Spirit at work through their lives. How can we be more honest with one another about the reality of how we're doing and the emotional, financial and physical challenges that we're facing at the moment? How are we letting others close enough to see the things where we need God's help, where we need to grow in Him, where we need the encouragement of others? Healthy families are places where it's okay to not be okay. I don't know about you, but I've needed people in my life to love me and to minister God's grace to me when I haven't got it all together. And there's such a depth in our relationships that comes when we know that we're loved, even when people know the truth about our imperfections. Let's not allow social distancing to create an emotional distance to our relationships with one another. And finally, I'd say that I think we can learn something about how to share as the family of God. These are times when resources on many levels are stretched, when the disparity between poor and rich is only going to get greater, but also where there are those of us who've always had plenty, and we're realising that our confidence and security in the material just is going to be shaken at this time. Families share their resources. In our household, we don't divide the evening meal based on who contributed the most towards it. Jesus calls us to serve, and his example of servanthood is absolute sacrifice. How can we look to meet the needs of others rather than focus purely on the needs of ourselves? How can we share generously with our finances, our possessions, our time? And how can we share the hope that we have in Jesus as well at this time? Amongst our church family, we have many who volunteered to be local responders, shopping, delivering prescriptions, gardening for those who were unable to. There are those who are involved in local food banks, those also who work with our Reach Response partners who are working to help some of the most vulnerable at this time. There are also neighbourhood groups springing up, stopping people from becoming isolated, phone calls to simply be a listening ear and prayer for those who are in need. One of our community leaders shared with me how she's offering extra hours at work for free for a colleague who is just really struggling with managing the childcare at home. There are so many ways in which we can demonstrate God's heart of love and provision at this time. Being the family of God is part of our demonstration of being the good news. As I read recently, this description of the church in Acts, they were being knit together to declare something with profound social implications. A new temple was being constructed, but it wasn't made of stones. Rather, it was a relational network of communities illuminating the centrality of love. It left its imprint on every facet of their social existence. The significance of this cannot be underestimated. They did not have well-rehearsed worship bands, magnetic preachers and packaged Bible study material to buffer their church life. There was little to hide behind. This is why Paul was concerned that the churches quickly mature as unified communities of self-sacrificial love. What an encouragement to us in this time. Whilst there's frustration and grief at our inability to be in the same room, there's also an opportunity for us to be no longer relying on our Sunday meetings as the only context for our fellowship, but for us to become a truly relational community, illuminating something of God's heart. And we can also share what we have as a family by inviting others to be part of it. Our needs are not just physical, but also spiritual, and there are many needing a comfort and a hope that goes beyond practical generosity. A number of our communities are being able to become that place of family to those who are new to the idea of faith in church and are able to invite them in to find a place at the table in this time. An invitation to the family of God and to discovering more of what following Jesus means is an incredible thing that we can share with others. But we do need to be a family in the first place. As Jesus prays for the disciples in John 17, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. Being one family in God is part of us sharing with the world that He's their Father. So my challenge and my invitation for you today is to consider where your place is at the family table. Maybe you've got used to showing up for dinner once a week and want to figure out how you can be part of family life on a daily basis. Or maybe you need to consider what lenses this time gives you an opportunity to take off. How does God want you to change your perception of what it means to be the church together? And maybe your heart is longing to see more people sat around our family table, and it's time to find new ways to invite them in. Jesus came to give us sight not just for the present, but to give us spiritual eyes of faith for the future. We might not be living in the fullness of His calling to us as the church right now, but we can choose to consider how we step forward, grow, and allow Him to mould us into more of that family for the future.